Hi everyone, welcome to the Frugal Kitchen. Today I am making Snickerdoodle Cupcakes. This is going to be a low sugar copycat type recipe from a bakery from Chicago where my husband and I got our wedding cake a few years ago. We had gotten a Snickerdoodle wedding cake with vanilla icing, and it normally comes with cream cheese icing, and we got a version with the cream cheese icing for our 1 year anniversary. And our anniversary was a couple months ago, and I decided, I didn't think about this until recently. We don't live in Chicago anymore, and I thought, ooh, I want to make, a cupcake that tastes like the one we got from Sweet Mandy B's in Chicago, except mine's a lot healthier. So let me tell you where I got this recipe. So the cake part of this recipe is from dinnerthendessert.com. You start with half a cup of butter and 2 cups of sugar, which I have sort of split up between some real sugar and some sucralose. I used 1.5 cups of sucralose and half a cup of white sugar. And I also didn't use butter, I used vegan margarine. So you're going to go ahead and cream your sugar and butter. This recipe does have eggs and milk in it, but I believe there are fairly simple substitutes for both of those if you wanted to make this vegan. I didn't want to deviate too much from what the original Sweet Mandy B's recipe might be because I was already using whole wheat flour, which is pretty much never used in baking, and sucralose, which is also never used in baking. So after the butter and sugar are creamed, add 2 eggs or 2 egg substitutes. You'll see I add my eggs one at a time, and that's in case one of them happens to be rotten. And then you're going to add 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract and mix that stuff all up. So here's what it looks like, and kind of liquidy, not that great, and that's probably because of the sucralose. So now I'm going to be adding whole wheat flour, which I use instead of all-purpose flour because it's just better glycemic index. You'll be using 2.5 cups of flour total. One thing, going into this, I did not have high hopes for this copycat recipe because it was not advertised as a Sweet Mandy B's copycat recipe, because Sweet Mandy B's is a local chain in Chicago and probably doesn't have any copycat recipes on the internet, although I didn't check. I just found this and thought, ooh, let me see if I can recreate those cupcakes we had at our wedding. 2 teaspoons of baking powder and 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. And the reason I decided to make this, not because of my anniversary, because I'm not that clever. I had this container of cinnamon to use up because I bought cinnamon to replace, what I'd run out. I poured all of it into the new container, except I had like this little bit left over. So I needed something to get rid of the cinnamon in the container I purchased that was more than the quantity of the container I keep, if that makes sense. You've seen my other spice containers, so you probably know. And at this point, I kind of just guessed and said, yeah, it's good enough. That's about 2 teaspoons. Like, why break my neck trying to measure this? Then half a teaspoon of salt and an 1/8 teaspoon of cream of tartar. Shout out to the 1/8 teaspoon that my husband wanted to throw away because he didn't think we would use it. Ha ha ha, joke's on you, I use it all the time. Stir up all the dry ingredients together. I'd like to specify at this point that I was not intending for this to really be a copycat recipe of Sweet Mandy B's Snickerdoodle cakes, because theirs, I don't know if you're like me and you can really remember what things taste like. Theirs has an ungodly amount of butter, probably like 4 eggs would be needed for their recipe, and of course real sugar, and I was not going to do that. This is Natalie's healthy version that will remind me of a fond memory of getting married to Scott. So now we are going to have a cup of milk added. It says whole milk, so I kind of overfilled my milk powder. I make milk because then it doesn't go bad. So stir up your milk. The wet ingredients had sat for a little bit longer than I liked and kind of separated, so I'm stirring it up to better suspend the ingredients, if that's the right term. Then you're going to add the dry ingredients followed by the wet ingredients in thirds. So a third of whatever is in your bowl plus a third of the water, or sorry, the milk, and mix that in batches. So Sweet Mandy B's is my husband's favorite bakery. He used to buy these peanut butter Rice Krispie treats with chocolate on the top all the time. And when we got engaged, he knew that we wanted to get our cake from there. I specifically did not tell them that it was a wedding cake. We had a very small wedding. Technically, we got married at the courthouse with no witnesses, and we had our photos taken in the Chicago Park, Maggie Daley Park, actually, right after. And a few days later, we had a party at our house and had maybe 30 people showed up, and we served a Sweet Mandy B's cake. It was just white, plain. I think there was a solid 1 tier or 2 tiers. I forget what they gave us. And it was the Snickerdoodle cake, but we added vanilla buttercream frosting instead of cream cheese frosting as it normally came because Scott's not a huge fan of cream cheese or cheesecake. And we did not save any of that cake for our 1 year anniversary because his opinion was, oh, it's going to taste bad. And I thought, whatever. Like the last time I got married, I didn't last a whole year, and I didn't get a chance to taste the top of my cake on our anniversary. So I wasn't gonna like have a fight about this. So we went on. Well, our 1 year anniversary was during COVID. We went on a very what do you call it? Isolating trip. And before we left, we went to Sweet Mandy B's, which was fortunately open, and got cupcakes, 2 cupcakes of their Snickerdoodle variety, and we took it with us. We drove to our little trip, which was a tiny house in the middle of nowhere in Illinois, and we ate our cupcakes while hiking, and they kind of like didn't survive the trip very well. We had to like eat the icing separately. It fell off. But it was very good with the cream cheese frosting, and I thought, oh man, I wish I kind of had it this way on our wedding. But it was great, and now we don't live there anymore, and I would like to just keep making this on our anniversary since we can't get the real stuff. So right now, I'm making the powdered sugar for the icing. Icing recipe comes from dessertnowdinnerlater.com. And I chose this icing recipe because it involves pudding packets, and that was the easiest way to get a low cholesterol cream cheese. And also, I guess that part would have been vegan. So I'm doing half a cup of sucralose and sugar mixed together, so I didn't really measure how much I used for either one. Throw it in the Vitamix to make it powdered sugar. And now I'm making milk because that is involved in this recipe as well. So this recipe called for 3.4 ounces of instant pudding mix, and the instant pudding mix I have is 1.4 ounces. And I don't know if there was shrinkflation recently or what, but I think you can buy a 3.4 ounce box of pudding anymore. I think it was 2.6 was the biggest box I saw last time. And so I made half the amount of milk. So I made a 1/4 cup of milk, stuck it in the fridge, and after the cupcakes were cooled, I popped them in that container. You're going to want to cook the cupcakes at 350 for 15 to 20 minutes. So I did 17 minutes, which is the sweet spot in between that. I don't really know if the milk has to be cold when you make pudding, but I'm assuming it does. And this recipe said half a cup of cold milk, 3.4 ounces of pudding mix. And since I didn't have enough pudding mix, I reduced my other ingredients by half. So I'm mixing it up, and the recipe also says to let it stand for a few minutes, because 3 minutes, because it'll get thicker. And I was like, well, Jesus Christ, it's really thick already. How is it going to stand and get any thicker? So I thought I had not enough milk. So I added some water, and I'm pretty sure this was just water out of the sink faucet instead of cold water. And I don't know if that affected it. Maybe it did. P.S. I live in the Phoenix suburbs, and our cold water is at the moment hot because we don't bury our water lines deep enough to have them stay cold. I don't know what the deal is. I've never had this problem. I didn't think I had this problem when I lived in Vegas. So I'm doing half a cup of margarine instead of a whole cup of butter. And then 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. And by the way, the recipe for the Snickerdoodle cake itself does have a cinnamon frosting version, but since that wasn't how Sweet Mandy B's made it, I decided to do this with the pudding. So add in the powdered sugar that you made earlier, if you made powdered sugar. Then throw it all in the stand mixer, and I used that wire whisking thing to kind of make it fluffy. And I tasted it, and it was quite buttery tasting, like way more buttery than I thought frosting needed to be. And I know that it's a buttercream frosting recipe, but I was a bit surprised by how much butter there was. So I threw in some cold water to mimic milk, I guess. I didn't want to make more milk because I'm lazy and terrible. If you're enjoying the recipe so far, please like, share, and subscribe to help me reach more people who want to eat healthier. So the frosting ended up pretty thin after adding the water, as one might imagine it would. And I wasn't super satisfied with it. Honestly, before I added, like, when I started out with a 1/4 cup of milk, that was the right thickness. I only messed with it because it tasted so buttery, and I didn't want to make more sugar, but then I was like, I guess I have to make more sugar. So here I am putting in extra sugar. The reason I didn't want to make more sugar was because the blender was wet and all my sugar stuck to the side of it. So I'm having to scrape it off like it's, I don't know, ice on your windshield. And I guess you can tell I live in Chicago for a long time now based on all these things I'm saying. And that part was a little frustrating. Like, I don't even know how much sugar it was. Maybe a 1/4 cup? Probably. I don't think you could make any less in the Vitamix and have it actually turn to powdered sugar. You need to reach the blades by a certain depth. But that definitely helped with the flavor. Like, it's not as buttery, but it's also not thick enough to be very good icing either. So after the cupcakes are all out, I'm sticking them in this container. I kind of wanted to shove them. You remember those cupcake cakes where all the cupcakes were stuck together and it was just like one layer of icing? That was my goal for this, but it didn't really work out that great. So here's one of the cupcakes after it's cooled. And the icing is thicker than it used to be, but not really very thick enough to make icing. I will admit that the icing kind of broke apart. I don't know if it was the pudding or the margarine maybe. Sometimes I find margarine breaks things apart. And it's kind of, you can see the little pieces of the chunks of pudding in there. And it's still thin. But it's very good. I will say it's not as cinnamony as I wanted. And that's probably because the original recipe comes with its own cinnamon frosting. There's a very overpowering cheesecake flavor to this. So if that's what you want, you'll enjoy this recipe. But it was pretty good. It's pretty good otherwise. And I am really sorry that I messed up the frosting. I think I would do a 1/4 cup of butter instead of the half cup maybe next time. So thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this, and happy eating.